Right, people, for today's math lesson, we're going to be looking at solving one-step equations with negatives, but the focus is going to be negative fractions and decimals, and particularly when you are dividing and or multiplying. So I know it gets old to hear this, but how do we think of equations? We think of them as like something that's balanced, like on a scale. And the way that we keep things balanced is by taking something off of one side and taking the same thing off of the other side. So whatever you do to one side of an equation, you do the same thing to the other side so that you keep it in balance. You keep things equal because, after all, equations need to be equal. So let's look at three example problems to help this make a little bit of sense. Our first one deals with negative 4/5 times x, which is equal to negative 8. So right off the bat, I've got this side of my equation and I've got this side of my equation. Two different sides, and I need to keep them balanced, and all while trying to get x isolated by itself so that I have x equals blah, my final answer. So how do we get rid of things that are with a variable? We use inverse operations because inverse operations undo each other. So just like tying a shoe and untying a shoe are inverses of one another, every operation has an inverse. So in this case, negative 4/5 is being multiplied by x, negative 4/5 times x. So it's inverse, the inverse of multiplying something is to divide it. So we're going to be dividing negative 4/5 on both sides of the equation because when you divide, it undoes multiplication, therefore that part of the problem cancels out, and all I'm left with is x. Now, one note, when you divide a fraction, how do you divide fractions? Well, in this problem, we're going to be doing negative 8 divided by negative 4/5. And when you divide fractions, you really end up multiplying by the reciprocal. And that's what this division problem is actually ultimately to solve it. You're going to turn it into this multiplication problem and then solve. So some people will, instead of writing divided by negative 4/5, instead of doing that, let's get rid of all this. They'll just write times negative 5/4 because multiplying by the reciprocal of a fraction is the same thing as dividing by a fraction. So even though I'm writing multiply, since I'm multiplying by the reciprocal, that's the same thing as division, and it will still cancel that out and isolate x by itself. So however you want to write your inverse operation, it's up to you. Ultimately, though, if you have to divide a fraction, you will be multiplying by the reciprocal. So some people view it as a time saver to just write right off the bat, multiply by the reciprocal. And so if we did that, we would end up getting a negative times a negative is a positive, so my answer is going to be positive. And 8 times 5 is 40. 1 times 4 is 4. So our final answer, simplified, is x is equal to positive 10. And that's how you would solve this type of equation. We'll look at another example. We've got negative 6 is equal to 3/2 times z. Well, I want to get z isolated by itself. And to do that, I need to get rid of the 3/2. And since that's being multiplied by z, I need to divide by 3/2. So I could write divided by 3/2, or you could multiply by the reciprocal, since that's what we're ultimately going to do. I'm going to write multiply by the reciprocal. So that cancels out, and whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. And we're going to make this whole number over 1, and then we're just going to multiply. So I can tell that my final answer is going to be negative because I'm multiplying a negative by a positive. And then if you do that multiplication, you get 12/3, which is the same thing as 4. So ultimately, z is equal to negative 4. And there's the work and the logic behind that problem. Okay, we'll end with one decimal example, because I did say at the beginning of this we're focusing on negative fractions and decimals. So here I've got n divided by negative 1 and 6/10, 1.6, which is equal to 5. So to solve and figure out what n is equal to, I need to do the inverse to get rid of negative 1.6. So since the problem is originally a division problem and divided by, the inverse of division is multiplication. So if I multiply by negative 1 and 6/10, inverse operations undo each other, therefore that just kind of cancels out, and I'm left with n. And whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. So I'm going to multiply by 1 and 6/10 over here. And as a reminder, when you multiply decimals, just pretend that they're whole numbers temporarily. And we're going to get 80. And since the first number has one place value, a decimal place value, we're going to put 1 into our answer. So the final answer here is negative 8. It's a negative because we multiplied a positive by a negative. Also, make sure your answer makes sense. 5 times 1.6, 8 is pretty reasonable. If I had left it as 80, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And 80 divided by 1.6 is not going to get you to 5. That doesn't make sense. Negative 8 seems like a reasonable answer. Negative divided by negative, positive. Good. Check. All right, so that's a little mini lesson on solving one-step equations when multiplying or dividing fractions and decimals. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, good luck with your work, and bye-bye.